Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank His Majesty King Mohammed VI, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and of course the High Commissioner, Mr. Alami, for the kind invitation to attend this international forum. The global financial crisis and its broader economic resonance throughout the international system has, among other things, served to refocus attention on the need for enhanced North-South dialogue in arriving at a new compact among nations on global governance. Over the last decade or two, the process, as well as the outcomes of globalization, has benefited the more powerful economies of the world at the expense of the developing countries, especially in Africa. Yet the global financial crisis has a disproportionate negative impact on the African economies. The African continent has already suffered a decline in foreign direct investments, the tourism industry, levels of aid and assistance, exports and remittances of nationals living and working in the more developed world. Khatija Sharif, in an article in The Thinker, a journal published in South Africa, which I edit, points out, and I quote her, "Every year more than $1 trillion in capital flight is spirited from developing countries. According to the African Union, $148 billion is siphoned from Africa alone, with 80 to 90% permanently stashed in tax havens, many of which specialize in certain services ranging from hedge funds to geographic proximity and the incorporation of shell companies." She also argues that more than 60% is, quote, "the product of multinational transfer mispricing." African countries, many of whom straddle the Atlantic, face unprecedented levels of underdevelopment, poverty, unemployment, and lack of basic health care, education, and infrastructure. It is clear that the socio-economic conditions of these countries will only worsen unless there is a collective will and a collective commitment on a global scale to address these challenges. Surely, one of the critical starting points is to conclude the Doha negotiations in favor of the most marginalized. Both the USA and Europe have to be ready to make the necessary compromises on agricultural subsidies without demanding compensation from these countries to open their markets to the detriment of their own economies. Another challenge is to transform international institutions such as the United Nations and its agencies, the World Bank and the IMF, to enable them to be more responsive to the real needs of the African countries. How then should we characterize the April 2009 meeting of the G20 in London? Even a cursory glance at the decisions taken shows that in many important respects they failed the test. Take the commitments to ODA. In 2005, the G8 announced with great fanfare a decision to double their ODA, in particular to African countries. 4 years later, they find solace and comfort in renewing the same pledge. One hopes that we would not have to wait another 4 years for the same pledge to be repeated. It is true that at the London meeting they agreed to increase from $250 billion to $750 billion the IMF lending capacity. There is a further commitment to double the borrowing limits of the poorer countries and to bring about greater flexibility. Leaders of African countries, civil society in the developed and developing countries, other international agencies involved in assisting the poorest of the poor have to be vigilant if they are to protect their interests. The more powerful countries should not be allowed to introduce other conditionalities which would impose a structural adjustment type program in another guise. Nevertheless, increases in ODA, other forms of aid, cheaper and more flexible borrowing and repayment facilities, and more and better access to the markets of the more prosperous and developed world can only be effective if you have a responsible, caring, honest government based on the will of the people. Within this framework, Political leaders across the political spectrum, political parties, trade unions, business associations, religious bodies, academics, intellectuals, the military establishment, and civil society as a whole have to learn the art and culture of putting the national interest first. They have to demonstrate, even when they disagree, a deep passion and commitment to the well-being of the poorest of the poor. Without this type of depth and breadth of commitment, the political, economic, and intellectual elites may well prosper, but the given country will continue to lurch from one crisis to another. A multi-party dispensation, free and fair regular elections, accountability to the electorate, economic policies and practice designed to stimulate rural development, rural incomes, and rural infrastructure, if pursued, can help to lay the basis for a sustained assault on poverty and underdevelopment. In that context, external assistance can be a formidable partner. It is, however, critical to stress that the multinational companies that make high profits from the exploitation of Africa's natural and human resources also have to come to the party. They should not engage in bribery and corruption. They should invest back into the economy to strengthen its base, and they should stop the wholesale shipping out of capital to their home base. The challenge then is both internal and external. International agencies have to learn that they don't always know best. Lobbying groups in the developed world have to desist from seeking to influence their governments in pursuit of sectional and sectoral interest. Aid should not be designed to primarily aid the giver and not the beneficiary, and that it is in the interest of humanity if the poorest countries in the world, in particular Africa, are empowered effectively to deal with what is gradually turning into a humanitarian crisis. Furthermore, a growing economy in the African continent offers great opportunities for investors to make a reasonable rate of return on their investments. A trilateral interregional approach could help us to redefine the Atlantic from the prevailing Eurocentric or Euro-American-centered defining of the Atlantic as the North Atlantic, as expressed in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and its corollary of the forging of a northern transatlantic community as the basis of what is commonly identified as Atlanticism. In the Atlanticist ties between Europe and the United States via Britain, in terms of its special relationship with the USA, and the continental powers of the Franco-German axis, which occasionally finds itself counterpoised against the so-called Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-American wing of the transatlantic community. After all, there is a South Atlantic that has not been part of and privy to this northern Atlanticism, but which is increasingly emerging as an intercontinental zone of engagement and cooperation between Africa and the Americas, all up and down the Western Hemisphere. There is, for example, increasing definition being given to South Atlantic ties between Africa and the Caribbean and Africa and South America. This is happening with the emerging consolidation of a South American as opposed to a purely Latin American identity in the launching of the Union of South American Nations and its affiliated South American Defense Council, which aims to promote a common or cooperative security dialogue with UNASUR. This consolidation of a South American identity complements an emerging African continental identity, which as yet remains insufficiently consolidated in terms of Africa's continental sovereignty and cohesion via the African Union, but which has opened the way for transatlantic dialogue between Africa and South America in the South American Africa Forum, a dialogue that is additionally complemented and reinforced in the links between South Africa and Brazil within the trilateral context of the India-Brazil-South Africa Trilateral Dialogue Forum, IPSA, an initiative that has been underway since 2003 and which last year resulted in the first IPSAMA naval exercises between Indian, Brazilian, and South African navies. The unfolding trajectory of globalization has to be altered. Globalization cannot be wished away. It has to be harnessed, nurtured, and utilized for a better Africa and a better world. Thank you very much.